All right, I should be recording now. Woohoo! All right, everybody say hello to people that are gone. Hello, people who are gone.
Hello, people who are gone.
All right, here's hoping that things don't glitch out on me. So we're talking about imperialism. I've recorded the first part of the progressives because this period of imperialism and progressivism really kind of they layer over the same time period. And I'm trying to get us through imperialism and into World War I. So you're going to need to listen to the progressive lecture on your own time. Now, part of the exchange for that is that we're going to be reading the imperialism documents in class on Friday. We're going to be talking about them. So that will save you a little bit of time in preparation for the discussion board. So what we'll see is that, I just lost my train of thought. Sharon interrupted me. I am recording, by the way. That's okay. So the progressive lecture you're going to need to listen to, it is going to be kind of lengthy because there's a lot of information to cover. And I have, the first section is already posted on YouTube. I think I sent out a reminder yesterday about that. And that really covers kind of the basics of progressivism. I have yet to get time to record the second part, which is on the progressive presidents specifically. So I should have that done at some point today, worst case scenario tomorrow. So you'll be able to listen to that. So you can start paying attention to the progressives. And what I really do in that lecture is run through kind of the high points of the general progressive movement, what they were trying to accomplish, what they were trying to do, what their goals were. The big lesson you should take from the Gilded Age politics game is that the power of a third party to force the two major parties to pay attention to what's going on. The progressives who start with reform movements at a very small kind of city level, when they see how the populists are able to shake up the two major parties, they start to become their own political force within the two major parties. So that by the time you get to the early 1900s, you have progressive wings in both the Republicans and the Democrats. And it's progressive presidents that dominate the first 20 years of the 20th century. And so some of this it kind of backtracks a little bit to the 1890s. Again, I'm not saying it's a coincidence that the 1890s are the period of imperialism. But, 1892, you do see the Populist Party. And what better way to distract people from their concerns at home than to talk about concerns abroad? Okay? Coincidence? Maybe. I'm not suggesting it's a grand conspiracy. I'm just saying some things tend to be true. That being said, we're going to talk about imperialism. This will layer a little bit going back to the 1890s, going towards the progressive presidents. So we'll talk about imperialism during them. But I won't be touching on their domestic policies. That comes in the progressive lecture. You have a quiz next week over progressives, over imperialism, Gilded Age politics. Be sure that you've listened to those lectures and give yourself time to do that. One of the things that we're doing by reading the documents is giving you time to listen to those lectures so that you should be able to go home Friday and say, okay, this is what I'm going to write on that discussion board. You should be able to post that and then have plenty of time to respond to somebody else over the course of the weekend. Okay? So let's get started. We're going to describe the growth of imperialism and its consequences during the progressive era and explain the reasons for such imperialism. Excuse me. Couple of terms you need to be sure you know. The idea of imperialism is acquisition or control over the government and economy of another nation, generally by conquest, although it doesn't have to be. There's a term called hegemony. Hegemony is Hegemony. And what that means is like an economic influence. It's like kind of it's economic influence or authority influence. Like typically with countries, it's going to have to do with, I have a bigger military than you have, don't make me come over there, right? Hegemony is very much kind of what your parents do to you when they control the purse strings, right? So they get to tell you what to do. So you've got imperialism by direct conquest and imperialism by hegemony. And both of those things are active during the 1890s into the 20th century. So all of this is aided by the technology. We've had a massive innovation industrialization, technology, all these things that we talked about with the nature of business in the Gilded Age, and the foundations of what becomes our modern society technologically. And socially, really, in a lot of ways. The European countries become very, very powerful in Africa. This is the period of Belgium going into the Congo. This is the period of the British going into South Africa, the French going into North Africa. Africa itself is being carved up by European powers. One of the reasons, and we'll touch on this a little bit with World War I, one of the reasons that European powers aren't fighting each other a whole lot in the 1890s is because they're busy conquering other places. Okay, understand that you have a long period. They call it the long century. Okay, that really begins roughly at the end of the French Revolution. Some people date it back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars around 1814. Going up until the beginning of World War I in 1914, where the idea is that Europe, for the most part, is not at war with each other. Once Napoleon's out of the picture, everybody kind of settles down. And the name of the treaty, Westphalia, maybe? I can't remember exactly the name of the treaty off the top of my head. But they come up with this treaty where they kind of divide up Europe and kind of agree with how things are going to be. And for the most part, that peace holds. Now, you do have the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1870s, you do have the creation of Italy as a nation-state as opposed to being a bunch of little principalities. The Franco-Prussian War is the big one. Basically, Prussia, kind of what Germany was not exactly a country in the 1870s. Was it 1850s? Something like that. Around that period, Prussia emerges as the dominant German state, and it kind of unifies all of Germany. And they invade France, and they kind of kick France's butt, and France has to pay a bunch of reparation payments back to Germany and all this kind of stuff. So you've kind of got this bad blood between France and Germany that will bubble back up going into World War I. So that's a little bit of the backstory of World War I, but really the Franco-Prussian War is kind of the exception. It's this little bubble of conflict in really what is a long period of peace for Europe. And the reason for that long period of peace is because they're going places where people are less technologically developed, they're less, they're not industrialized, these are agricultural economies, and they're going in and they're kicking butt and taking names. And that's because they have the equipment and the industrialization to do so. And so that's going to be one of the big factors. Now, what's driving this kind of imperialism by Europe is not only, hey, these are easy pickings, these people aren't as advanced. It's easier for Germany or France or Italy or anybody else to go conquer a less developed nation than to pick on another European nation, right? That creates havoc and that upsets their business relationships and exports and imports. But hey, if I go over to a less developed country, they have raw materials, so I can get their raw materials that feeds my industrial machine, and coincidentally, I have a guaranteed market for my finished products, okay? Think back to the American colonies and how we were involved in kind of that colonial economy, where we were sending raw materials to England, they made stuff with it, and then they sent the finished products back. Economically, that puts you at a disadvantage, okay? So this is one of the things that's going to happen with these imperialistic colonies, is that they're going to be disadvantaged economically, they're going to be taken advantage of militarily, and socially their people are often going to be taken advantage of. So these are trends that are taking place in a lot of ways, and I don't know how much you went into this in world history, but these are trends that are taking place globally. The U.S. is a little bit late coming on board. We're kind of like, oh hey, Civil War had us real distracted. We had our own resources. Remember, we've got all of the western United States. So the move west is allowing us to exploit ourselves, right? We've got our own indigenous people we can be awful to, right? And the American Indians. We don't have to go somewhere else. And that's true until you get to about the 1890s. Remember, 1892, Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, suddenly the frontiers closed. 1892, you've got populists popping up. By 1896, you've got Plessy v. Ferguson. So the 1890s, you really had the United States sort of coming of age, I guess you could say, where we no longer have these resources within ourselves. It kind of forces us to go out of our shell, right? We have to leave the house. We have to go somewhere else to get the resources, the consumers, the markets that we need. Remember, this is one of the issues with the populists and the fact that they want low tariffs, because they want to have markets all over the world. So this emerging globalization is becoming a thing in the 1890s, and initially this is what propels the United States into imperialism. And we are behind the rest of Europe, as we were with industrialization. Okay? One of the themes of the documents you're going to read kind of talk about that. So keep in mind this idea for needing raw materials and places to sell products. You still also have that underpinning of manifest destiny that had kind of driven our westward expansion. And if you think back to the colonial period, when the Puritans come to North America, there's a strong sense of God has given us this land, right? Oh, the Indians aren't using it, God means for us to use it. We're here, to quote Winthrop, to be a city on a hill, to show the world how it should be done, okay? That goes back to the colonial period. This concept of manifest destiny, even though it wasn't labeled as manifest destiny in the 1600s, has pervaded the American system. And in the 1840s, it's labeled manifest destiny. And even after we officially conquered and we're from coast to coast, we continue to apply the notion of manifest destiny to other places, okay? This cartoon right here, 10,000 miles tip to tip, 1898. This is the year you must know. You must know this year. For STAR, you need to know it to be an intelligent person. You need to know it if you're going to understand why the U.S. gets involved in the global situations we get involved in. 1898 is when this starts, okay? This is showing you the consequences of 1898, which is that we are 10,000 miles tip to tip. And you can certainly see Puerto Rico over here. You can see Hawaii. You can see the Samoan Islands. Manila, which is the Philippines. And this cartoon will make sense when we finish talking about the Spanish-American War. The next concept you must know is Alfred Thayer Mahan's navalism, his naval theory. Mahan's naval theory is incredibly important, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. In fact, many would argue that Mahan's naval theory is the underpinning for why we have World War I in the first place, right? What he suggests is he's a Navy guy who's also a historian. And he goes back and he studies the great empires of the world, and he argues that only countries with a strong navy end up having a global influence. That the degree to which you influence the world is tied to your ability to have a navy to move troops from one place to another, right? And then having a navy allows you to intimidate other countries. And so that's what he's wanting to do. And so that he also says that in this period of globalized economy, that you have to have a navy to protect your shipping. That not only did you, if you look back historically at strong navies and how they allow empires to be created, but then if you look at empires that have good, healthy economies, it's because they have a navy that can protect shipping, okay? And the most recent example that Mahan's going to point to is the British Empire, okay? They have a strong navy, and this is why they were able to be so powerful, not because they were the biggest country, or even necessarily had the most natural resources, but because they had the navy to protect far-off spots. They had the navy to protect shipping. And so he comes forth with this idea that what countries need to do if they want to be a big player on the national stage, or in the international stage rather, is that they need to invest in navy, particularly steam power. Okay, and so he writes The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. And very quickly, by 1900, the U.S. Navy is going to be the third biggest in the world. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, progressive president number one, okay, he is going to be a huge fan of Alfred Thayer Mahan's naval theory. Kind of a little bit of backstory. I'm going to kind of diverge a little bit talking about Teddy Roosevelt. He had come up. He was born. He was little during the Civil War, so he wouldn't have fought in the Civil War. He comes up. He's very much kind of one of those progressive reformers. He works in kind of the New York political system. opposes the party machine, the political corruption. He's one of those guys that tries to enforce the saloon regulations. And he's known for being very much a progressive reformer. So by the time you get to like 1890, he's working his way through the New York political system. He's gotten a low-level job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, okay, built upon his reputation as being this reformer. The benefit for him is that the Secretary of the Navy, whose name escapes me at the moment, is kind of largely disinterested. He wants to go play golf or something, or whatever it is they did in 1890, which I think was golf. And so he doesn't want to be bothered by running the Navy. And so Teddy Roosevelt, whose capacity for work was legendary, like this is a man that like slept for like 3 hours a night. Like he wrote I don't know how many books and like did politics and was the president and like did all this. He was just like a whirlwind of activity. And so he would basically run the Navy. And so he's a huge fan of Mahan's naval theory. So when he's bought into this in the early 1890s, he's the one who basically creates the U.S. Navy. Because the Secretary of the Navy can't be bothered with anything. And he's like, oh, we'll let Teddy do it. Teddy will handle it, right? And so Teddy's basically signing the Secretary of the Navy's signature on all this stuff, authorizing the creation of all these ships. So you have in this very short amount of time the U.S. Navy becoming actually fairly significant and, most importantly, fairly modern, right? A lot of steamships. And you started to see that some going back into like the 1850s where a steam power became more important. But we're talking full-scale, like metal hull, advanced steamships for the 1900s. And this is due to Teddy Roosevelt, so that's why I wanted to kind of mention him in connection with Mahan. Mahan's theory is also going to influence Germany. It's also going to influence Britain. Kaiser Wilhelm, who will be the Kaiser when World War I breaks out. One of the reasons Germany is investing so heavily in its military is because he believes in Mahan's naval theory. And so here you've got Kaiser Wilhelm building up the German Navy, which of course the German Navy and the German submarines are going to be a causation for World War I. So he's investing in all of this. This makes Britain nervous, so Britain starts investing in more Navy. So again, Mahan's naval theory not only influences the United States imperially, with Teddy Roosevelt and the buildup of our Navy, but it's going to lay the groundwork for one of the major causes of World War I. So Mahan's naval theory, incredibly important in global history, also incredibly important in U.S. history. Other influences that we have going on with imperialism, and you'll definitely see this when you read the documents on Friday. You have this idea of Anglo-Saxonism. That, being kind of Western European, read into that, white, probably English speaking, although maybe French, possibly German, that those people are just a little bit better than everybody else, right? We've touched on this before when we talked about nativism and the idea that there was a preference for American-born citizens, and again, read into that white. And Anglo-Saxonism is kind of a global perception of that. But it's not just about being American-born. It's about where do your ancestors come from, right? So if your ancestors come from, Turkey, or if your ancestors come from Africa, then, well, you're just not really quite as good. Like if your ancestors are from Southeast Asia, then there was probably, you're just not as advanced. Maybe your abilities aren't as naturally good. Remember, this is a period of social Darwinism. This is the period of Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories. This is back before evolution becomes this, convoluted with, we can't teach evolution because it's going to challenge Christian beliefs, right? You have to understand that in the late 1800s, the notion of evolution was an accepted theory by people of faith. And the suggestion was that it was okay to believe in evolution, right? That this explained so much, the survival of the fittest and genetic selection and all that kind of stuff. And how convenient. This is why England had managed to conquer so much territory, because Anglo-Saxons were just a little bit better than everybody else, okay? Again, part of the backstory of World War I and ultimately the Holocaust in World War II is this notion that there are some people that are just not quite as good as others, okay? That are just genetically different. And that explains why, they live in huts and we live in brick buildings, right? That explains why they're agricultural and we're industrialized, because we're just genetically a little bit superior, okay? That's what they're suggesting. So Anglo-Saxonism, the concept of eugenics, which I actually explain a little bit in the progressive lecture, because progressives are big into eugenics, right? Progressives like to study things. They like the scientific basis for everything. And so they're going into that, and they're saying, hey, that, we can look at certain people, and if they're alcoholics, they need to not have children because they're going to pass down alcoholism. Of course, now we know that there is a genetic component to alcoholism, but they tied it into not alcoholism, but, they're Irish or they're German or something like that, and that's why they're alcoholics, right? They tie it into ethnicity, and they try to determine who should have kids and who shouldn't. This is actually one of the foundations for the birth control movement, which I actually talk about in the progressive lecture. So you have that. Protestant missionaries, let's go Christianize these people. This is particularly powerful in Southeast Asia, particularly with Hawaii, okay? You have Christian missionaries going to Hawaii, trying to make sure that these Hawaiian peoples are good little Christians, very similar to what they tried to do to the American Indians, okay? Boom and bust cycles also make expansion an easy outlet, right? If we start to have an economic contraction, if we start investing in our Navy, if we start investing in going someplace else and conquering them, that allows for kind of an outlet, not only of frustration for people who are frustrated and want to get out of the United States. How the move west was a pressure valve, right? Going back to the colonial period, right? We've talked about this multiple times. That when you can't make it in the established community, you can go out to the frontier and you can try to make it there. So imperialism in this period of a closed frontier has that pressure valve. It also allows for investment and for financial kind of fluidity, and allows for economic growth, okay? So all of these things influence the way imperialism kind of shapes up. This cartoon right here, Puck was a political magazine in the late 1800s. Very often had political cartoons and political statements. Think National Review is kind of a conservative aspect of this. I'm trying to think of a more liberal one. I'm not thinking of one off the top of my head. So they were would put out these cartoons. So there's a lot of political cartoons from the late 1800s by Puck. This one right here shows Colombia. One of the interesting side notes. You have, as far as representations of the United States, in a lot of ways you have Uncle Sam and you have Colombia. Colombia is the female representation. Uncle Sam is the male representation. It's not until World War I, right, that you have it consistently being Uncle Sam, right? Prior to World War I, it was kind of either or. It was actually tended to be more Colombia than it tended to be Uncle Sam, because typically countries were perceived as feminine because they nurtured a people and all that kind of stuff, right? And there's a whole gender history argument we can make about why it transitions from Colombia to Uncle Sam, but I won't chase that rabbit. Anyway, so this is Colombia, right? You can tell stars, blue stars, white stars on a blue jacket. Up top, she's got the red and white stripes on the bottom. But if you look closely at what she's wearing, ship on her head, her hat, her Easter bonnet. In fact, that's what it says, Columbia's Easter bonnet down at the bottom. She's putting on this Navy hat, okay? Notice the little feathery thing is expansion. The hat pin is a sword, has guns on it, right? Notice at her belt, you have a bayonet, you have a gun, you have an artillery bag. You have the sense that the United States is now going to try on imperialism, just like everybody else, okay? It's our turn, right? When you read White Man's Burden, it'll make even more sense, right? So absolutely, here's the United States as this attractive female. We're trying to be fashionable, right? Imperialism is the fashionable thing to do in the late 1800s. So let's back up a little bit, all right? Because the U.S. doesn't all of a sudden in 1890 go, hey, we're here, okay? We start dabbling with imperialism in the 1850s, most notably in China and Japan. And I think I've touched on this a little bit when we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. China was a mess in the mid-1800s, right? You had European powers carving it up, trying to gain spheres of influence. You had the opium trade and the opium wars. So China is kind of a train wreck, okay? And that's part of what's propelling China's immigration. But China also has a lot of people. And it also has a lot of good stuff. Remember, that's one of the reasons why China doesn't engage in exploration early on, is because we have all the good stuff. Why do we need to go find it, okay? So we start kind of being interested in establishing connections in China, particularly in the 1840s, as kind of the East Coast is getting very industrialized. You're also going to see in Japan, right? We're interested in Japan because here's the thing, and I mentioned this before, Japan isn't trading with European powers, right? They let the Dutch come in like twice a year for like 2 weeks at a time or something like that. And that's all they're trading with European powers. So the U.S. wants to establish, they see Japan as an opportunity, and they want to get some influence in China. You're also going to see that in 1867, William Seward is going to purchase Alaska, which initially everybody says, why on earth do you want that frozen wasteland? What good is up there? He buys it from Russia, who by the middle of the 1800s is trying to begin their industrialization, get caught up. They need the cash, right? And so you're going to see that we start kind of stopping off at islands. If we're starting to reach out to Alaska, if we're starting to reach out to Japan and reach out to China, we need places to stop, because in the mid-1800s, while we do have steam power, we don't have a lot of refrigeration, right? That's not going to kick in until the late 1800s. So these sailors need to stop someplace and get food, right? Sometimes they need to fix a boiler or something like that. So we have to have places between the United States and Asia for us to stop off. So this is kind of what's going to propel us into finding these territories. There's also a huge interest in the canal across Central America. Everyone realizes that to go around South America is the long way, okay? So what happens, and it becomes not quite as crucial for the U.S. once we have the Transcontinental Railroad that connects the East to the West. But before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1860s, I mean, you're talking, if you wanted to go from New York to Asia, that was a long trip, right? Because you're going around South America, and it's taking forever. It's taking like 3 or 4 months, okay? The Transcontinental Railroad shortens that some, because then you can take things, you can cross the United States on rail, and then get on a ship in California, and then go to Asia, but you're still looking at a couple of months worth of travel. So there starts to be some interest in creating this canal, which initially picks up from Britain and France, right? Because they're a little bit ahead of the U.S. on this scale. So you're going to see that Hawaii, you're going to have sugar planters. These missionaries go to Hawaii. Of course, Hawaii is kind of not quite midway between, say, California and Asia, but it's close. And so they start stopping there pretty regularly in order to refuel and get food and stuff like that. So it doesn't take long before missionaries find out that, oh, these Hawaiians are these innocent, naive people, and we can go share our Christianity and teach them civilization, because, oh my goodness, the women walk around in grass skirts and no tops, right? We have to change that, right? Because think about the sailors and all this kind of stuff, right? So they start sending Christian missionaries there. While they're there, they discover pineapple, and they discover, hey, sugar grows really well in Hawaii. We can have sugar plantations, and how convenient there's a native population that we can then encourage them to learn to work hard by working on our sugar plantations. Wink, wink, right? So there's a whole lot of exploitation by so-called Christian missionaries in Hawaii. Matter of fact, the Dole Fruit Company, Sanford Dole, gets his start in Hawaii. Not a super nice guy in a lot of ways. They come in initially as missionaries, develop these plantations, make a lot of money, then become very interested in making sure that Hawaii has a favorable trade relationship with the United States. This is a problem when Hawaii is not a part of the United States, because now Hawaiian sugar is subject to tariffs. Remember, we have sugar plantations in the Deep South. Okay, so Louisiana sugar plantations are not going to be super happy that Hawaii is competing with them for sugar. And so you're going to have a little bit of a tariff struggle there. That's going to actually propel the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. And I mentioned up here, I don't know if I touched on that. So China, we're going to eventually kind of push open, literally we're going to call it the open door of China. We're going to demand basically that everyone has a fair shot at China. The U.S. never is quite as big of a player in China as the other European countries. Primarily our influence is with Japan. Because Commodore Perry shows up, he basically intimidates Japan into signing a special treaty with us. And so there's a really interesting connection with Japanese development and American development, where you have kind of this sense of superiority, this kind of sense of cultural, we do it a little bit better, the way we do things is superior. And so really Japan is going to industrialize super quickly. And they're going to follow a model that, I don't think they intended it to be like the United States, but that's kind of how it works out, where they industrialize quickly and then they engage in their own imperialism. This is kind of part of the backstory for going into World War II. And also a little bit, Japan will come in on the side of the Allies in World War I and will be very upset because they kind of get cut out of the treaty process at the end of World War I. So that's kind of the backstory there. Again, you're going to have Sanford Dole comes into Hawaii. He basically gets a group of Marines that have stopped to resupply, gets them to support him in taking Queen Liliuokalani hostage, and forces her to basically, resign from the throne, and she abdicates and then signs Hawaii over to these planters, and they control it for a period of time while they kind of muscle around with President Cleveland and then later President McKinley, trying to get recognition, trying to get Hawaii annexed as a territory, so then Hawaiian sugar would not be covered by the tariffs. So that's the backstory there. This is Queen Liliuokalani. One of the sad things about Hawaii is Queen Liliuokalani was very westernized. She was Western educated, but she was also very proudly Hawaiian, and advocated for Hawaiian culture. When she comes to the throne, because her uncle abdicates. He abdicates because the sugar planters are being so difficult to deal with, and they're threatening to overthrow him. So he steps down, his daughter steps in, or not his daughter, his niece steps in, and then she starts to try to redo the Constitution to give more power back to the Hawaiians. Really, Hawaii is a very sad story. It's a story not quite as sad as the American Indians, but it's close. They take the Hawaiian people, they often keep them in poverty, they use them on the plantations, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of the backstory with Hawaii. We tend to forget that because Hawaii is a state now. We think of Hawaii and we think of Pearl Harbor and how dare they attack the United States. Understand that for Native Hawaiians, they have a real love-hate relationship being part of the United States. I think ultimately they're glad to be a part of the United States, but it's a convoluted history, and I just don't have time to go into it. But it's kind of interesting if you ever want to do any reading on it. So American imperialism, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, we touched on this briefly back in the fall, which has to do with the fact that Latin American countries are declaring their freedom from Europe. Okay, and as they're declaring their freedom from Europe, the U.S. basically says, hey, European powers, step off. This is our hemisphere. This is our neighborhood. If they want to be free, you let them be free. And if you remember me saying that Britain was pretty cool with that, right? Because Britain had lost their major colony. So if the U.S., this is kind of when the U.S. and Britain start working as friends and allies. So the U.S. is going to tell European powers like France and Spain and all that kind of stuff to say, hey, step off. This is our neighborhood. That works out really good for Britain because now Britain doesn't have to worry about some other European power getting a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and they can focus their attention on Africa and Asia and India. So that's kind of the backstory there. So the U.S. kind of claims the Western Hemisphere is our neck of the woods. And in the meantime, in the 1820s, throughout the 1800s, you have a lot of these places in South America, Mexico, declaring their independence, becoming their own countries. Now, we touched briefly, I think, on, or maybe I didn't. No, I think I'm confusing you with the other class. That Mexico in the 1800s, right? No, I did touch on it because we talked about Mexican immigration and the Mexican Civil War. So you have Mexico begins to have a very tight relationship with the U.S. economically. where the U.S. is investing there and all that kind of stuff. And so Mexico in particular is going to be under that hegemony even before American imperialism really kicks off. This is going to continue to be more of an issue in Latin America as we get into the 1900s. Most notably Cuba. Okay, Cuba in 1890s is still controlled by Spain. It's the last place that Spain holds. Okay, now Spain hasn't really been relevant since the Spanish Armada. Okay, so Spain is not really a threat, but they don't want to lose Cuba. Cuba is a sugar island, right? They make plenty of money from sugar, and they don't want to lose this. And plus, this is their last claim to having an empire, their last claim to the former glory that was Spain. And so they don't want to lose it. Unfortunately, the Cubans want independence, especially by the early 1900s. And Spain had allowed Americans to be heavily invested in Cuba, and so you've got a lot of that going on. And so Americans are going to be very puzzled and very concerned by the tensions between the Cubans and the Spanish. And they're not going to want to see any disruptions. They don't like there being revolutionaries. They don't like people arguing for independence and all that kind of stuff. So beginning in 1895, we start to have a serious guerrilla campaign. And by guerrilla, I mean, like terrorist. Okay? We've kind of substituted the term terrorist for guerrillas. So think in terms of, kind of sneak attacks and trying to kill people like on the sly and blowing things up, on that kind of stuff. And so you have a serious guerrilla campaign by Jose Marti. You have the Spanish creating these reconcentration camps in Cuba. Now, I think I touched on this when we talked about the Indian reservations, right? The U.S. comes up with this idea of, we'll create a reservation and we'll put all the American Indians there. Well, FYI, Europe sees that and they go, that's a brilliant idea. You get all these people, these native people, and if you can't control them, you put them all in one place. And then you kind of can keep an eye on what they're doing. And so the British use that in South Africa. The Belgians use it in the Congo. The French use it in North Africa. So this idea of a concentration camp, it starts to become a real thing in the 1890s. And so the Spanish use this in Cuba. Right? And they start putting all these Cubans in these reconcentration camps for their quote-unquote safety, to make sure that they don't get injured by these, guerrilla warriors who are trying to blow things up. And what's going to end up happening is that the guerrillas start attacking American property, right? And American property starts being affected by this. And so this is going to create some tension in Cuba, and it's going to cause Americans to be very concerned about what's going on. Now, what you're going to see is that President Cleveland and the Democrats, who are very concerned with maintaining control over the Populist Party, if you remember correctly, they start telling Spain, dudes, really, you need to, you're messing with our money, you're messing with our property. We've got American citizens who are very upset about this. Of course, we don't ever worry about the American Indians, right? It's about this time that you have the massacre at Wounded Knee, if you recall that from Aaron Huey's video. You also have some people like Theodore Roosevelt. You've got Henry Cabot Lodge. He's a senator, that say, you know what, we need to not just turn to the Spanish and tell them to play nice with Cuba. We need to not just tell the Spanish, the Hawaiian planters to be nice to the Hawaiians. We need to actually go in and take that stuff over. Those places need to be part of the United States, right? So you've got this huge kind of trend, and they tend to be Republicans. Not all.
Pardon the interruption. At this time, we would like for you to ask you to please suspend all hall passes at this time. Please keep your students in your classroom until we notify you. Thank you.
So what we see is that, I totally lost my train of thought, that it's mostly Republicans that advocate for this. It's, Democrats, you're going to have a few that maybe you're kind of interested. Remember, Republicans are business-minded, and so they're going to see the benefits of having this global economy. So Roosevelt and Lodge are the big names you need to connect with kind of that pro-imperialist mindset. Yes, go United States, we need to take over other places. Cleveland is going to be much less likely to do that. McKinley, when he wins the presidency, he's not super hep on, getting us signed up for imperialism. He's very much more moderate than that. But you have this Republican strand that's really clamoring for the U.S. to go in and take over Hawaii and take over Cuba. 1897, Spain will respond to McKinley's criticisms, and they will say, okay, we'll remove Governor Weyler and put somebody else in charge. That doesn't really change their behavior, but there's some attempt by Spain to try to do what the United States wants, because by this point in 1897, the U.S. is the big dog on the block, right? Very clearly, Spain is barely holding on to their influence in Cuba, and U.S. are the ones that are really kind of controlling things. So what will happen is that as we have in 1897 going into 1898, continuing actions by the Spanish to repress the Cubans, you have more American property being destroyed. So McKinley says, I'm going to send a battleship into Havana Harbor in order to keep an eye on Americans and their property. Okay? The USS Maine will blow up. Okay? When it blows up, and actually it blows up because they store the ammunition too close to the boilers. But we don't discover that. We don't figure that out until like the 1970s, right? So when it happens in 1898, everybody says, oh, it's the Spanish. They resented having a battleship there. And so they had one of those little mines go off right next to the battleship. And then, of course, like I said, in the 1970s, we find out what really caused it. And it's kind of like, oops. Of course, by then, it's way after the fact. So you have McKinley sending the battleship there. 1898, you have a Spanish diplomat writing a letter that gets intercepted by William Randolph Hearst. And in that letter, he basically insults McKinley, calls him a tool. And so when that gets published by William Randolph Hearst, the American public says, how dare they criticize our president? Oh my goodness, how disrespectful. And so there's all this cry out. And then, William Randolph Hearst kind of institutes this yellow journalism. It's him and Joseph Pulitzer. And their magazines that they control, their newspapers, have these big headlines. And they document what they call the atrocities perpetuated on the Cubans by the Spanish. And they have all these moving stories about poor innocent women being attacked and raped and defiled by the Spanish, and how the Spanish are thwarting liberty and interfering with these poor innocent Cubans who just want to have their chance, to be independent. And then they document, the De La May letter and how dare the Spanish insult our president. And then they start talking about the battleship Maine when it blows up, and how awful, I can't believe that the Spanish attacked our ship like that. When are we going to do something about these Spanish? Okay? This cartoon right here is just kind of the big type word of the yellow kids. This idea of these big, bold, exaggerated headlines. That's yellow journalism. And you need to connect yellow journalism with American imperialism. Those two things go hand in hand. And that can be fair game on the STAR test. This is another cartoon. Here's Uncle Sam, saber in his teeth, pushing up his sleeves, ready to go to war. If you kind of look at some of this, you got the De La May letter, Cuban butcheries, insults. I think there's the Spanish insolence right there, and Cuban brutalities or butcheries or whatever it was. So yeah, you've got Uncle Sam ready to go to war. And that's really kind of the attitude as we're moving into February of 1898. So the Maine will explode. They blame it, blame it on Spanish. The call is Remember the Maine, very similar to kind of Remember the Alamo. And then you're going to see that in April of 1898, Congress will recognize Cuban independence. Now, understand that the Spanish still technically hold Cuba. They haven't left Cuba. But in April, we recognize Cuban independence. And we say, oh, yeah, no, Cuba's its own country. How dare the Spanish be in Cuba? So we kind of unilaterally decide that Cuba is now a country. And so what will happen is you'll have a lot of pressure from Democrats. We don't want to engage in imperialism. We don't want to be like the Spanish. So we've got that political division happening in the United States between people who are pro-imperialist and people who are anti-imperialist, which this connects with your discussion board because that's part of what you're going to have to do. The anti-imperialists are going to argue for the Teller Amendment that basically renounces all American claims to Cuba, except we find a workaround. We basically pass another amendment that allows Cuba to be independent, but makes Cuba have to clear everything through the United States, okay? Which, is that really a country? You know. Anyways, so we start off with the Teller Amendment. Cuba's going to be independent. This is what we're going to do. And it's really all about American business interests. And so very quickly, once we recognize Cuban independence, Spain's like, well, gee, what do we, now we have no choice. We have to go to war. So you have a war with Spain. It's mostly a naval war, right? Most of the significant fighting is going to take place in the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines, which were a Spanish territory in Southeast Asia, kind of close to Vietnam, kind of close to Australia. This is where the United States will first gain control of the Philippines, which will matter when we get to World War II. And Spain had controlled the Philippines for some time. And so very quickly, because we've built up this huge navy, right, we send our navy into the Philippines. And Admiral Dewey basically kicks butt and takes names, defeats the Spanish very, very quickly. We will then blockade the island of Cuba, and then send our army into Cuba to take Havana. And this is actually kind of where you see that it takes us a few months to kind of win in Cuba. This is where you have San Juan Hill, Kettle Hill. This is where Teddy Roosevelt makes his name, okay? So he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, kind of drove this naval expansion. Then the Spanish-American War happens, and he's, come on, we got to go to war, we got to go to war. So as soon as the war is declared, he basically resigns his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to go fight with the Army. Now, he doesn't join the Army in the sense of, I'm going to go sign up and be an enlisted guy. What he does is he creates his own kind of auxiliary group called the Rough Riders, and it's a bunch of kind of middle class, upper class dudes who sign up. They provide their own equipment. They go fight alongside the Army, right? And he becomes very famous. If you ever go to the Remington Museum in Fort Worth, there's lots of pictures of Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. Frederick Remington was an artist that William Randolph Hearst sends to Cuba. And Hearst actually tells him, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Okay? So William Randolph Hearst, his whole task is to draw these pictures that he will then send to Hearst, who will then publish them in the newspaper, and he'll create the headlines to get everybody worked up for war. So a lot of Remington's pictures depict Roosevelt doing these really brave, courageous things. Now, side note, he does fight in Cuba. It's not that he doesn't fight. It's not that the Rough Riders aren't a thing, because they are. But you also have a lot of black American soldiers that fight alongside Teddy Roosevelt, and in some cases actually start the charge up the hill. But we tend to forget about them and focus just only on Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to make his name as a Rough Rider, charging up that hill, helping win Cuba back, really putting his money where his mouth is, and all that kind of stuff. The war's over by August, lasts barely 6 months, and so the U.S. is going to win pretty quickly in Cuba. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. And so what will happen is the Treaty of Paris shortly after that. Basically, this deal is going to be Cuban independence. So Spain says, okay, fine, Cuba's independent. The U.S. has recognized it. Cedes Puerto Rico and Guam. Guam is in the South Pacific. Puerto Rico is in the Caribbean. Cedes those Spanish territories to the United States. And we get to have the Philippines for $20 million. Okay? So we get Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines as territories for $20 million. And we get kind of a big brother, little brother relationship with Cuba. And then you're going to see shortly after this, you're going to have McKinley signing up for the annexation of Hawaii. So finally, we get the annexation of Hawaii as part of kind of this overall trend towards having territories. After all, we're going to have the Philippines, we're going to have Guam. We need to have a stopping off place between the United States and the Philippines, right? So we annex Hawaii. What's interesting about the Philippines is that there had been a Filipino independence movement at the same time as there was a Cuban independence movement. Okay, so the Filipinos wanted their independence, and they initially welcomed the Americans, thinking that the Americans are going to let them be independent like they're going to let Cuba be independent. So that was never part of the plan, right? There's no Teller Amendment for the Philippines. And so the U.S. basically denies the Filipinos independence, at which point these Filipino independence fighters turn on the Americans and start to attack them. So there's largely an undeclared, really not undocumented, but at least unpublicized war in the Philippines between Americans and Filipino independence fighters. And it's pretty brutal. You're talking about, we do the concentration camps, just like the Spanish did. We're killing people in ditches. We're committing atrocities because we're trying to get control of the Philippines, and they don't want us there. And like I said, this is largely kind of an ignored conflict, but it's a result of American imperialism. And so you're going to have, about 3 years, 2.5, 3 years of significant fighting in the Philippines. This will matter because William Howard Taft, by the time you get to the end of the insurrection in the Philippines, Teddy Roosevelt's president, okay? And he says William Howard Taft, who will be progressive president number 2, William Howard Taft will go to the Philippines, and he will actually do a lot of good work in the Philippines. He basically tells the military to step down, and to back off, and he starts focusing on building hospitals and schools and roads and lots of good little progressive reforms like progressives like to do. But it actually kind of eases the tensions in the Philippines, and it makes things better. But the Philippines will not be given their independence until 1945, even though they wanted their independence in 1898. So it's just kind of an interesting side note to American imperialism that often gets overlooked. You have a group, again I mentioned the political division, that tends to fall along party lines, not completely, but generally speaking. Okay, with Republicans being imperialist, Teddy Roosevelt said, yes, we want to, our system of government is so great, democracy is so great, our country is awesome, and we can take all of the good stuff of our country and spread it all over the world. And then you're going to have Democrats who are looking at the concerns of the immigrants and the factory workers, and they're saying, do we really want to bring on board more illiterate, more poor, more untrained people, right? We're already struggling with our own immigrant workers and with how to balance immigration and how to take care of, blacks and American Indians and immigrants. So do we really want to take on this responsibility of other countries as well? And so there's Democrats arguing this. You've got a number of key speakers. I have on here Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, saying, hey, we shouldn't be taking this on. We shouldn't be doing this. This violates our principles in the Declaration of Independence that argue for self-determination. We're going into the Philippines and we're basically determining for them, and that's not right. We're going into Hawaii and we're determining for them. We're violating all these principles. And then we're taking on responsibilities that we're not handling very well within our own country, let alone outside our own country. And so you're going to have kind of this tension going on there. Some of this is not going to be very, like the concept of missignation. What's going to happen when American soldiers or sailors, fall in love with a Filipino woman and then they have a child and all, So some of this isn't very attractive. Some of it's very kind of eugenics based, but some of it, is a legitimate criticism. So understand the Anti-Imperialist League and the criticisms of imperialism. And again, this will matter when we look at overall the imperialism documents on Friday. So a quick side note, okay, before I jump into how imperialism shapes out during these 3 different progressive presidents. First off, McKinley, assassinated in 1901. Okay, he comes in. He wins in 1896. He's very much kind of a moderate. He's seen as a reforming Republican, cares about big business, but also realizes that having a bunch of union problems and fighting with your workers is not good. So he's really kind of this balanced kind of approach, right? Well, then you get to the 1900 election, and they want to make sure that the progressives are really on board with him. And because maybe he's not quite as progressive. So they say, well, let's get Teddy Roosevelt. He's known as this big progressive guy. He's gotten all this press because of the Rough Riders of the Spanish-American War. So everyone's going to jump on board with Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was really good with the press, right? He knew how to talk to the muckrakers. He knew how to work with them. And so that wasn't McKinley's strong point. And so the idea was this will be a really good kind of balance to the ticket. And Teddy Roosevelt actually accepts the nomination for vice president reluctantly because that's not his personality, right? His personality is one of being very active and being very involved. And the vice presidency is not that, right? It's very much kind of sit in the background and twiddle your thumbs. But he does accept it finally. And then, shortly after the inauguration, McKinley gets assassinated by some crazy guy who thinks God has told him he needs to kill McKinley. And so McKinley gets shot, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes the president. To which Marcus Hanna, the head of the Republican Party machine, is not happy because he knows that Teddy Roosevelt's a progressive and one of his big goals is to take down the party machines. So Teddy Roosevelt becoming president in 1901 is the beginning of the progressive changes. His personality, this overwhelming, active president, this ability to take his ideas, communicate them to the media, who then communicates them to the people at large, builds this huge momentum for progressive reforms that starts with Teddy Roosevelt and continues up into World War I. Okay, so understand that that's the backstory. He is, absolutely for imperialism. Right? He believes Americans should exert their influence. But what's interesting about Teddy Roosevelt's approach to imperialism is while he advocates for American influence, he also is very much about talking big and not actually, like even when we look at his progressive policies at home, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of this is what we're going to do, and this is I'm going to make sure this happens. But then in practice, he's actually often very kind of willing to talk to people, willing to kind of not go there. So he uses the Navy, but he doesn't usually send troops in. Okay? That's going to be a difference with Woodrow Wilson, and we'll talk about that in a second. William Howard Taft, I touched on him. He is not big on the military because his experience in the Philippines taught him that military guys tend to get a little heavy-handed and get a little out of control. Woodrow Wilson will win in 1912, which I'll talk about the 1912 election, which is incredibly important, so you absolutely must listen to that. The 1912 election is a part of, it's a four-way election. You actually have four candidates. You have Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat, Taft as a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt will run as a progressive, and Eugene V. Debs will run as a socialist, okay? And that election is really only between the Progressive Party and Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson will win because Teddy's votes are going to be split between Taft and the Republicans and him. And so, again, third parties tend to just mess with things, right? And so Wilson will win. He claims that he doesn't like Teddy Roosevelt's kind of, loudmouth approach, threatening the military. But he's the exact opposite, where he says he doesn't like military intervention, but he actually uses it way more than any of the other progressive presidents. He's constantly sending troops in. We actually invade Mexico under Woodrow Wilson because he's like, oh, well, they're threatening American business, and we have to act. I'm not a Woodrow Wilson fan, FYI, so if I sound sarcastic when I talk about it, it's because I can't help myself. But yeah, so he claims that he's going to strike a new note with American imperialism, but he doesn't. He's actually worse than Teddy Roosevelt was. And all of these presidents are going to be considered progressive, and they all advocate for increased government and increased American influence. Okay, that's incredibly, incredibly important, so don't forget that. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. Again, you'll want to layer this with the progressive lecture because these things kind of go, we're talking about the imperialism part of it, but then there's a whole domestic side that goes with these presidents. This is the Imperialism, the Dance of Death. This is very clearly an anti-imperialist cartoon. That engaging in imperialism is going to challenge our essential nature as a country, our nature of the Declaration of Independence, the nature of freedom and liberty and all those things. Come on. While the Senate is debating during 1899 about the finer points of territories and government and Hawaii and all that kind of stuff, we have the issues with the Filipino insurrection. I already kind of touched on that a little bit. Most notably, the Puerto Rico, the Four Acre Act of 1900, basically makes Puerto Ricans second-class citizens, puts an American governor in charge of Puerto Rico. Now, it's a little bit different now. We have kind of fixed that somewhat. But Puerto Rico is still much poorer than the rest of the United States. There's much higher unemployment. has been permanently affected by kind of our imperialism there. Personal note, Foraker, that's Joseph Foraker. My maiden name is Foraker, so that's actually a distant relative of mine. Go Forakers. Took away civil rights from Puerto Ricans. There's actually a Mount Foraker in Alaska, by the way. He actually did not get along well with Teddy Roosevelt. My master's thesis, in part, has to do with the relationship between Joseph Foraker and Teddy Roosevelt and how they kind of fell apart. Anyways, kind of a whole interesting side note there. And I may touch on some of it in the progressive lecture because there's a part about the Brownsville raid that happens and how Teddy Roosevelt handles that. And Joseph Foraker actually stands up for those soldiers, and that's part of the backstory for why they don't like each other. Foraker actually tries to get the Republican nomination in 1908, and then Marcus Hanna kind of like shuffles him aside, and Teddy Roosevelt's basically anointed Taft, and so he gets like two delegates or something ridiculous. But so kind of personal history there. 1901, we sign up the Platt Amendment, where basically we say, yeah, Cuba, you're independent, but we get to tell you what to do, right? That's like, I always compare it to like your big brother that thinks he can show up and boss you around, even though he is really nothing. Technically he's not responsible for you, and yet he gets to control every aspect of your life. At least that's the way my oldest son treats my younger sons. But so kind of see that this cartoon, another kind of, I don't know that it's anti-imperialistic, but it's certainly questioning of imperialism. You've got Columbia, you've got Uncle Sam. My perception is that these kids dancing Ring Around the Rosie in the background are probably American Indians, immigrants, those kind of people. And then here we go, outside of the United States, here come more babies. Notice the skin color. You got Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, Philippines, those 4 countries. Again, remember, Cuba is technically independent, but not really. So this question of now what are we going to do with these people? Because now we're responsible for these, poor people, for the jobs and for, kind of maintaining peace there, and how is this going to affect things? So what will happen, this happens before McKinley is shot in 1899. McKinley will argue for an open door in China. You have things are kind of heating up in China with the Boxer Rebellion, and so China's kind of destabilized. And European countries are threatening to go in and invade and basically literally take over China. And McKinley steps in and says, whoa, wait a minute, we need to protect China. They need to be independent. We all need to have a fair shot at her. And so he kind of gets everyone back into their corners. And so China stays open. The whole idea of an open door policy, though, is incredibly important, and this is fair game on the STAR test. This idea that China's open for anybody to trade with, and how McKinley and then later Roosevelt will continue to advocate for this open door policy. And again, it's kind of interesting. Here we had shut out Chinese immigration. We don't want Chinese coming in, but China better stay open for us. We better be able to trade there, right? We don't mind going there. They just can't come to us. And so this is going to be part of that backstory, part of why China is going to kind of be skeptical of the U.S. and later in the 20th century. Because, at the turn of the 20th century, we're basically treating them like they're fair game for anybody who wants to come along. And again, this is about alliances and agreements to protect trade. This will be some tension around 1914 going into World War I, too. Panama. Teddy Roosevelt, 1901, he becomes president. This idea about the canal through Panama. First the French, then the British try it. They can't get anything done, or maybe it's the British and the French. It's the French and the British. They can't get that done because the conditions there, there's mosquitoes, and you have you have these mountain ranges, and then you've got this big lake in the middle of Panama, so you got to cut through the mountains. And you got to kind of figure out how to drain. You've got different elevations. It's all this kind of crazy technical engineering stuff, right? It's actually, the U.S. coming in and creating the Panama Canal is a feat of American ingenuity and innovation and invention. And it's a huge technological thing. Every now and then they'll kind of pull out the Panama Canal as a technological aspect. So just kind of know that it is a big deal. It's important with medicine because we figure out how to handle malaria. that mosquitoes, pass malaria. So it's important medically speaking. It's also important, technologically and innovation-wise. Changes everything as far as transportation. That canal will not be finished till right before World War I starts. How convenient, right? So now, especially in 1914, 1915, 1916, when the U.S. is not technically fighting World War I, but we're supplying everybody during World War I with equipment and stuff, the Panama Canal will be very important because it makes it so much faster and easier, right? And so that's what's going to happen. The U.S., Roosevelt really wants a Panama Canal, like super bad. And so he encourages a Panamanian revolution from the, hold on a second. Yes? Yes, you may. Everybody needs to step out a second. I guess I'll stop my recording. I'm recording a lecture. That's okay. That's okay. Let's see. Escape. And now we'll come here. All right, my peeps, we'll be back.